Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a couple of quick things before we dive into this one today. Number one, I just want to ask you to do me a favor. My son Eli, he's 10 years old. Some of you may have seen him here and there on my channel. But he not only is really getting into history, but he's also trying to build his own YouTube channel. And right now he's doing some videos where he's doing tutorials on how to solve a Rubik's Cube. Kid can solve a Rubik's Cube in under a minute. And he's trying to get better every day. He just got his first 4x4 Rubik's Cube. But anyway, we're trying to get his channel monetized. You need 4,000 hours of watch time before you can start making money on YouTube. And he won't make much, a little bit here and there, but it might be fun. And we're trying to teach him responsibility with money and things like that. So his latest video on solving a Rubik's Cube is 9 minutes long. If I can get 20,000 people to watch that video from start to finish, he'll hit his monetization with the hours he already has. So I'm going to ask you at the very end of this video, I'm going to throw up a link to that video. I'm just going to ask you to watch it. Let it play in the background if you don't want to watch it. Hit the like button, leave him a comment. It would mean the world to me if you do that for him. And he and I are going to be doing a stream on his channel this weekend where we're going to be doing a tier list of our favorite Sabaton songs. He's really into Sabaton like I am. So that'll be going on. So I'm going to ask you to do that for me. I'll remind you at the end. But today we're going to dive into, I believe this is Weird History. And this is their video, What Was It Like Working in a Civil War Field Hospital? So let's go ahead and dive into this one today.
Whether you fought for the North or the South, being a soldier in the Civil War was a harrowing experience. And with wounded, injured, and diseased soldiers being brought in at a rate faster than they could be attended to, Civil War field hospitals were almost as dangerous, chaotic, and stressful as the battlefields themselves. So, today we're going to take a look at what it was like to work in a Civil War hospital. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other parts of American history you would like to hear about. Okay.
And they're doing pretty good. They got about 4 million subs, so probably a lot of you are already subscribed to that channel.
Okay, get yourself scrubbed in, because it's time to operate on some weird history.
But see, we're talking about Civil War history here, so nobody was scrubbing in, because this is before there was the full understanding of how disease and bacteria and infection work. That was something that wasn't really widely known then, and so they're reusing tools and surgical equipment, and they're just wiping stuff on their shirt before they move on to the next one. Infection is a huge part of this, and if we had modern medicine, the vast majority of these Civil War deaths would not have happened.
The American Civil War raged from April 12, 1861 to May 26, 1865. The war would
Now, it's important to note there's really no official date that it ends. People use different dates to signify the end of the war. I think the date they're going with at the end of May is when most of the major Confederate armies in the field have surrendered. Johnston surrendering down in North Carolina. But there is sporadic fighting that continues here and there. There's at least one Confederate, I think, naval ship that operates till the end of the year before it gives up. But end of May is a pretty good place to point to.
Ultimately claimed the lives of over 1 million Americans, 3% of the country's entire.
I've never heard that number before. The traditional death toll has been 600,000. In the last decade or two, estimates have kind of pushed that up to about 750,000. That's the first time I've ever heard somebody claim that it took the lives of over 1 million. I've never seen any reputable source claim that. 750,000 more likely.
Entire population at the time. Historians have noted that the Civil War claimed more American lives than all other wars the country has fought combined, despite the best efforts of those who worked in the field hospitals.
But it's important to note that it's the one war in which we are counting the dead on both sides as Americans, right? So you take that out, and neither side lost as many dead as we lost in World War II. But when you combine, it is the most. And you know, of course, this is kind of misleading. Obviously, this is not a photo of people that were nurses during the Civil War. The vast majority of medical personnel in the American Civil War are going to be men. There are women who serve, including one who receives the Medal of Honor, the only Medal of Honor given so far to a woman in our history, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who served on the front lines in the medical field during the war. But the vast majority would have been men.
Field hospitals were usually located close to the front lines, sometimes as close as just a mile away, which is a convenient walking distance, provided you hadn't just lost your foot to a cannon blast.
But he says field hospitals. I don't want to get too picky here, and I feel like I'm really kind of nitpicking a lot, but I just feel like the images are very misleading because these would not represent field hospitals. Field hospitals, you're talking either out in the open, maybe in a tent. You're certainly not, for the most part, talking about big buildings with hospital beds and blankets and things like that. You might have field hospitals in barns, in homes, whatever's available at that time. A lot of the field hospitals at Gettysburg, for example, were in barns or in larger homes and things like that. Whatever buildings happened to be in that part of the battlefield.
If you were a soldier who was injured on the battlefield, a field hospital would be your first stop for medical care. They also tended to be improvised facilities that were set up in local buildings like barns, churches, or even private homes. The field hospitals typically had very little in the way of supplies, particularly in the South. Many of the medications that Civil War doctors needed were manufactured in the northern half of the United States. In order to gain access to these medicines, Southerners had to get creative. Sometimes that meant running Union blockades or smuggling medicines to the South by sewing them into the petticoats of women who were sympathetic to the Confederacy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that went on. Smuggling medicine is one of those things you don't really think about too much, but it was a real problem in the South, just getting medicine. And it's important to note that one of the misconceptions, and I'm sure they'll mention this, one of the common misconceptions is that Civil War hospitals, field hospitals, didn't have anesthetic. And so you've got guys biting down on sticks and biting bullets while they're getting amputated fully awake. That did happen. It definitely happened, especially in larger battles because they would very quickly run out of anesthetic. But anesthetic was available. And so guys like Stonewall Jackson, when he had his arm amputated, he was out. He was not awake when that was happening. Officers almost always in smaller battles would have had it, and then until they ran out, the enlisted men too. But it's a misconception that there was not anesthetic and that everybody was wide awake getting operated on.
Surgeries were often performed on whatever flat surfaces were available, like tables or unhinged doors.
Yep.
They were also often performed outdoors, which not only helped to ventilate the extremely unpleasant war wound smell, but also allowed surgeons to use natural daylight during an operation instead of dim candlelight.
Yep.
Which was a good thing, because their eyes were perpetually tired from the sheer amount of surgeries that had to be performed. Nobody was prepared for the unprecedented human toll of the Civil War.
Yeah, that's all true at times. But you have to understand, it's not like this was going on day after day after day. You know, there are stretches of the war where there's not a lot going on. You know, from the Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 till the Peninsula Campaign in late spring 1862. In the Eastern Theater, there's no major battle. And even Bull Run was not a huge battle by Civil War comparison. In the West, you've got some battles going on like Shiloh, but again, big stretches where there's not a ton going on. There's not a lot of major battles back to back to back. Not until you get to 1864. That's when you really start to see kind of the incessant warfare happening.
So the surgeons wound up treating a lot more patients than anyone was expecting. Overwhelmed physicians often worked themselves past the point of exhaustion, and the circumstances created a generally chaotic and unnerving atmosphere. Patients had little to do but lay around. Some screamed deliriously and called out for loved ones, while others laid around quietly, looking pale from the effects of shock. Sounds like the DMV. Despite the best efforts of the surgeons, the hospitals tended to be perpetually crowded, and living conditions were so unfit for the wounded that many patients ended up perishing simply because of their hospital stay. Civil War soldiers fought in terrible conditions. In fact, twice as many soldiers succumbed to disease than to actual combat wounds.
And that's true for pretty much every war up until the 20th century. I mean, even World War I, you see, with the U.S. lost as many men to disease in World War I as they lost to battle wounds. It was about 50-50.
That sounds pretty bad. But it was actually a vast improvement over the numbers from the recent Mexican War, in which there were 7 to 10 disease-related fatalities for every combat fatality. Diarrhea and dysentery were extremely common and responsible for much of the death toll. Other prevalent diseases included measles, smallpox, malaria, pneumonia, and a weird skin condition known as camp itch, which is different from what you got from swimming in the lake that one summer. Luckily, doctors had an array of creative remedies at their fingertips, some of which actually worked. Scurvy was a fairly common problem among Civil War soldiers, and the remedy for it, regular servings of green vegetables, was among the least unpleasant, or most unpleasant, depending on how you feel about peas. Open bowel problems were treated with a plug of opium, while closed bowels were treated with an infamous mixture of mercury and chalk known as the blue mass. Respiratory issues like bronchitis or pneumonia were also treated with opium, or sometimes mustard or quinine plasters. If that didn't work, they might try bleeding the patient, the old-timey equivalent of drinking a glass of orange juice to get rid of a cold. Only to date, orange juice hasn't killed any presidents. Malaria?
I think they're talking about George Washington. Yeah.
Another common malady was treated with quinine. If none of that was available, they used turpentine.
Legit.
The aforementioned
That's true.
camp itch, a painful skin disease whose cause is still a topic of debate in modern medicine, was treated by ridding the body of the pests or with a solution of poke root. Dead tissue surrounding an infection would sometimes be covered in maggots to eat away the necrotic skin.
That's actually not the worst thing they could have done. I mean, it's not ideal, and it feels and seems kind of gross, but it helped. I mean, it did. It was better than doing nothing, and you didn't have antibiotics to treat it with. That wasn't a thing yet. But yeah, that's why a lot of the amputations happen. If you look at the records, a lot of these amputations, it's not like dude got shot in the arm and the next day they amputated it. It did happen that way sometimes if it was bad enough, but more often than not, it was weeks, even a month or more afterwards when the wound wasn't healing and it was starting to get infected that they would amputate, and many times by then it was too late.
The hope here was that healthy tissue would then grow in its place. Now you can start to understand why all those hospitals needed to be in breezy tents. And if you got shot, well, they'd probably just offer you some whiskey to kill the pain. Unfortunately for a lot of their patients, Civil War-era medical professionals weren't too savvy about things like germs, so they didn't use sterilization or really any hygienic techniques. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients, wore filthy, blood-stained garments from one surgery to the next, and usually operated with unclean surgical instruments. That is, when they used surgical instruments at all. Reports of doctors probing wounds with bloody fingers or using dirty knives as scalpels were not uncommon.
And it's not uncommon to the Civil War. I mean, that's pretty much what they did to James Garfield 15, 20 years after the Civil War. And they were probing and prodding and trying to find the bullet. They were digging. I mean, it's just they treated his body like their own personal, cadaver to experiment on. It was brutal.
And surgical sponges would be lucky to get as much as a rinse between patients. Not surprisingly, infection and disease ran rampant through such facilities. Even worse, the unsanitary conditions contributed to the rise of a necrotizing fasciitis known as hospital gangrene. Nearly half of patients who contracted gangrene perished as a result. Unfortunately, not every soldier could be saved, and a lack of manpower, time, and equipment meant that tough decisions had to be made. If a soldier was shot in the stomach, head, or chest area, it likely meant they wouldn't survive. So doctors would not operate on them, the logic being that the already scarce medical resources required
Triage
would effectively be wasted. These poor souls were kept as comfortable as possible with medication, but were basically left to perish so that stronger soldiers could be treated instead.
And again, that's not always the case, because not on every battlefield do you have these massive numbers of wounds that can't all be treated and you have to triage. That was more rare than it probably is being led on. And yeah, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy too, right? You say, oh, well, a stomach wound or a chest wound is going to be fatal, so why bother treating them? And then they die, and then you look at the fatality among those types of wounds. It's a self-fulfilling thing. Yeah, there's some truth to that. But then the problem with the limbs is that these mini balls, which if you've ever held a Civil War bullet, you can squeeze it in your hand and kind of smash it, at least the end of it for sure. Lead's very soft. And the way that those bullets, at the velocity that they were fired at, and the consistency of the bullet, when it would hit you, it would just shatter that bone. Like, so if you got shot in the arm, it would shatter the bone. There was no hope of setting the bone and having it heal. And so sometimes it was automatic amputation just because it was a guaranteed infection if you didn't take it off.
Sounds kind of like an HMO. However, if a soldier was wounded in the arm or leg, their chances of survival were deemed higher, and they would get some attention from a physician. At that point, if you were in the north, the surgeon would wash out the wound with a sponge. In the south, where sponges ran out fast, they typically used a cloth. The doctor would next probe the wound with his finger, looking for bits of cloth, bone, or the bullet itself.
Why cloth? Because even if you treat the rest of the wound, you get the bullet. If you got shot through your uniform and that piece of cloth ended up inside your body, that could get infected and that could be a problem. So you had to pull that out.
If the bone was broken or a major blood vessel had been torn, the surgeon would usually recommend an amputation, the closest thing to a mascot the Civil War had. For Civil War surgeons, amputation was one of the most frequently performed surgical procedures. Historians estimate that over 60,000 amputations were carried out during the conflict. In fact, it was so common that the patients started calling the doctors sawbones. According to Star Trek, this nickname would endure well into the 23rd century.
Yeah, my wife's great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of those who had an amputation. He was in the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Cavalry. They launched an attack on a fort at Petersburg, and he was wounded in the leg, left behind the lines. His leg was amputated by a Confederate surgeon. He ended up in prison and then spent the rest of his life with one leg.
Patients would be given anesthetic in the form of chloroform, which is pretty effective, but there was a downside. If the dose wasn't measured correctly, the chloroform could cause fatal cardiac arrest. Such cases were rare, reportedly only accounting for 0.4% of the total lives lost during the war. Nonetheless, chloroform is not considered safe by modern medical standards and is no longer in use. Given these operations were being performed under battlefield conditions, they had to be done fast. An experienced surgeon, who often worked alone due to chronic understaffing, could remove a limb in 10 minutes. They presumably included their best times on their business cards.
I feel like if you're on the receiving end of an amputation, that's not the kind of operation that you want the doctor to brag about how quickly he can do, right? Take your time and get it done right. Make sure that I'm going to be able to heal. Make sure that the blood vessels are tied off. Make sure that the stump is, adequately prepared in such a way to maximize the opportunity for recovering. Don't fly through it, but I get it.
These doctors often worked all night, with piles of amputated limbs reaching 4 or 5 feet in some cases. That's 4 or 5 feet as in depth, not feet as in feet. Despite the extreme conditions, 75% of amputees survived. However, that still meant a quarter of amputee patients perished. All the decaying corpses and body parts often made the smell of putrefying flesh completely overwhelming.
And not just the smells, but the sights. I mean, imagine going in to be treated for an arm wound and seeing a pile of arms laying outside the tent. Imagine what that does to you mentally. I wonder how many times guys were like, forget it, and they turned around and walked away rather than be treated because they knew what was facing them.
Doubly so in hot weather. So, long story short, there's a reason Yankee Candle doesn't make a Gettysburg surgery scent. Not all of the surgeons were experienced. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Since medical standards were very different in those days, students were able to complete medical school much quicker. This meant that many of the battlefield surgeons were essentially job shadowing. In fact, of the roughly 11,000 Northern doctors, just 500 had performed surgery before. In the Confederacy, the numbers were even worse.
I mean, again, that's kind of understandable. When you think about, let's look at the military aspect for a second. we've talked before about how when the war started, you've got, a couple hundred officers, high-ranking officers, field-level officers at most, maybe not even that many. And suddenly you need tens of thousands of them. So you've got guys that were lieutenants and captains before the war that are now leading armies. Same thing's going to be true for the medical field. I mean, the demand is so much greater than the supply. So that's an unfortunate reality of this.
Just 27 of their 3,000 doctors had surgical experience. And even if the doctor was experienced, there was a non-zero chance that they might have been drunk. Alcohol, like whiskey, was often used as an anesthetic, which meant there could be a lot of it lying around.
I feel like that's a little misleading, though, to kind of imply that a lot of them were drunk. Did it happen? Sure. And did they drink a little here and there just because of what they were dealing with every single day, which would be horrifying for anybody? Yeah. But this picture that they seem to be painting of like massive amounts of drunk doctors operating on soldiers, I don't know about that.
Soldiers were known to report that some of the surgeons were drinking the whiskey and operating under the influence. The military took these accusations seriously, dismissing doctors who were found to be drunk on the job. The only person allowed to be drunk on the job during the Civil War was Ulysses S. Grant.
Again, pretty misleading, and we've talked about Grant before. Grant was a binge drinker who couldn't hold his liquor. He drank way less than people seem to give him credit for.
Despite how well documented the era was,
Hooker.
Many myths about medical care during the war still persist to this day. For example, many movies would have you believe that amputations were carried out without the use of anesthesia. But as previously mentioned, that's not the case. In fact, anesthesia, first used in 1846, was common by the time of the Civil War.
Yep.
And there are over 80,000 recorded cases of its use. So why do so many believe it wasn't used? No one is certain. But at least one medical historian believes it may be because the anesthesia was so light, many soldiers assumed none was being used at all. Which, in fairness, sounds like the same thing as not using anesthesia. It is also widely believed that the treatments used in Civil War hospitals were substandard even for the time. However, other than treating malaria with quinine, pain with opiates, and vaccinating against smallpox, there were no specific general therapies.
Yeah.
No one knew what was causing disease, or what those diseases were doing to the body. So the medical care the soldiers received was, in fact, the best available.
Right. Again, it's important to look at history based on what was known at the time. We can't look back and think, man, that was brutal. How could they not be more, clean in their operations? Because they didn't know that mattered. We know that now. Anybody who's ever set foot in a hospital knows that now. They didn't know that then.
Even if it was kind of lame.
Yep, a lot of them.
As the casualties piled up, both the North and the South began to build general military hospitals.
Yeah, Chimborazo was huge. That was a big hospital complex in Richmond,
where soldiers could get a better class of treatment. Located mostly in bigger cities like Philadelphia, Knoxville, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, these hospitals tended to be well ventilated and heated. Good thing, too, because injured soldiers could be there for weeks or even months. Getting shot in the 19th century was like a Las Vegas residency. You're going to be stuck in the same building and high out of your mind for half the year.
Yeah, but that's not unique to the American Civil War. That happened in later wars, too. I mean, there were guys, if you ever read the book Band of Brothers, some of the guys in Band of Brothers who got wounded in places like Normandy or Bastogne spent a year or more recuperating in the hospital afterwards. It's not unique to the Civil War to have spent a long time in the hospital.
And whereas the field hospitals were held together by spit and polish, the general hospitals usually had it all, including kitchens, laundries, linen rooms, storerooms, chapels, and offices.
So if you ever are looking through military records and you see like the letters GH when talking about a guy who was wounded and where he was taken, that usually stands for General Hospital. And that means he was in one of these more permanent facilities. Once they got him stabilized, once they were good enough to travel, they wouldn't stay in the field hospital. They could move him to somewhere like in Washington or Richmond where they could receive further care.
Being much further from the front lines, General hospitals were much less chaotic. The staff spent most of their time cleaning, cooking, emptying bedpans, and administering medicines. And presumably, the doctors did not begin each amputation by starting a stopwatch. So what do you think?
Okay, so that was interesting. Can't say I agreed with all of it, and Weird History is not a channel I'm super familiar with. I've looked at a few things here and there. So maybe some of you can tell me a little more about your experience with those things and whether or not you find them to be pretty accurate. I might try to stick with their channel. Any further reactions I do, probably stick to topics I know pretty well, just so I can be cautious of that, since it seems like it was a little hit or miss. But as I asked you at the beginning, if you would please be willing to check out my son Eli's channel and let that video play, his latest one. We're trying to get that watch time up. It would mean the world to me personally, and I know it would to Eli as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.